Welcome to Downtown Sports. My name is Downtown Stephen Brown, and in today's video, guys, I picked out a couple of players on the Toronto Maple Leafs roster, and we're going to be talking about whether or not the Toronto Maple Leafs should trade them this offseason. The first player that I wanted to talk about is William Nylander, and Nylander being on a potential trade list is just something that seems evergreen at this point in his career. And while he did set career highs in goals with 34 and points with 80 and 81 last year, let me know down in the comment section if I'm alone in feeling like this. But watching William Nylander this past season was probably more frustrating than any other year that he's been in the league. Now, I'm not saying that I want William Nylander traded or that I think that he should be traded. I'm just saying that it's weird to be frustrated with a guy who set career highs in goals with 34 and points with 80 and 81 games. And maybe that feeling of frustration is me projecting how I felt about that second line as a whole onto his individual play, and maybe that's not necessarily fair because there's two other guys to talk about in that conversation, but he's one of those guys. Now, the numbers that are up on the screen, we've showed dozens of times, but William Nylander and John Tavares' combination this past season, they were good in terms of the overall shot attempts, the actual shots, the expected goals, the scoring opportunities, the high danger shot attempt share, playing in an offensive role, of course, but when you're looking at the actual goals for and goals against for that second line, considering that they're both playing up against secondary matchups because Matthews and Marner are seeing all the other team's best defenders, it's extremely disappointing to see them get outscored at 5-on-5. And if you're looking at the numbers for those two players playing together through the 2019-2020 and 2021 seasons, they do outscore their opponents 45-38 at 5-on-5, and all the other underlying numbers are positive. But then if you think about it, they only outscored their opponents by 7 over the course of 2 seasons at 5-on-5. Again, those are with secondary matchups. That's still kind of disappointing to me. Now, nearly $7 million would be difficult for some teams to fit under the salary cap. But after William Nylander's $3.5 million signing bonus is paid out to him, he'll only be owed $8.5 million in actual money over the remaining 2 years of his deal. And if you average that out to about $4.25 million a year for the next 2 years for a guy who can produce near a point per game pace and give you around 30 goals, there's going to be quite a few teams interested if the Maple Leafs were to make him available. This quote from Kyle Dubas from Luke Fox on Twitter, and Dubas on the core says he's open to changing for the better, but he's not interested in a lateral move. And what I think Kyle Dubas means by making a lateral move is making a move because you feel you have to, or just for the sake of it. Because when you do something like that, you end up trading Nazem Kadri, and the centerpiece you get back is Tyson Barrie. It's not that you can't win with William Nylander, and it's not that you can't win with Phil Kessel. It's that you can't win with either of those guys being the best player on your team. And for the early 2010s Maple Leafs, Phil Kessel was their best player. But for the Maple Leafs right now, William Nylander is arguably their third or fourth best player. And if you're factoring in who's playing in net, he's probably their fourth or fifth most important. And I have a hard time blaming the fourth or fifth most important player on the team for the reason why they can't make it past the first round. Obviously, he's a part of that. He's on the team. And for what he is and what he isn't, I understand it's frustrating, but I don't see a point in making a move for the sake of making a move. If it makes the team better, though, it makes the team better, and I'm willing to do just about anything to make the team better at this point. The next player that I wanted to talk about is Jake Muzzin. And this is a tough conversation to have because it revolves around his health. He started the year not necessarily looking like himself. He dealt with 2 concussions throughout the year, and even when he came back from that, Sheldon Keefe mentioned that going into that playoff series against the Tampa Bay Lightning, that he wasn't necessarily at 100%. So to know that, and then to see him play all 7 games against the Lightning and be effective, considering that the bulk of his minutes came playing up against guys like Steven Stamkos and Nikita Kucherov, it shocked me. And at different times, he laid some really big hits, and then he got hit really hard, and it made me nervous. But I got to give it to him. He really laid it all out there on the ice. The Maple Leafs really struggled last year to find a deep partner for Jake Muzzin that he could be effective with while still maintaining their 2 other defensive pairings. They started the year playing Jake Muzzin with Justin Hall like they have in years past, but those 2 guys playing together only seemed to make each other worse. And then they tried playing Muzzin with Liljegren, but Liljegren was just in his rookie season. It's not necessarily fair to put that on him. And then midway through the year, Sheldon Keefe said something to the effect that Muzzin was struggling carrying the puck and making plays with it. And towards the end of the year, and in that series against the Tampa Bay Lightning, they paired Jake Muzzin with TJ Brodie, and the two played phenomenal together. Looking over the numbers at hockeyviz.com, in the limited amount of minutes during the regular season that Brodie and Muzzin got to play together, they generated a fair bit of offense for the Maple Leafs at 5-on-5, and they were also very effectively defensively for them as well. You love to see all that blue in front of the net there. That means that there wasn't a whole lot going on. If Jake Muzzin can be healthy and put last year behind him and just return to being a dominant two-way defenseman, then I want him on my team. Especially because he plays a style of game that no other Maple Leafs blue liner does. But if it's anything other than a yes, if it's a maybe, a no, or an I don't know, the Maple Leafs cannot afford to have $5.625 million tied up in a question mark. They cannot afford to do what they did this past season with him. Plan A would be for him to just be healthy and playing well. Plan B, you could put him on LTIR and receive some cap relief that way, but it's not something that I would bank on. It's a complicated process, and it really only works out in your favor if that player is injured for the remainder of the season. Like what the Blackhawks did originally with Patrick Kane, like what the Lightning did with Nikita Kucherov a couple of years ago, what the Vegas Golden Knights tried to do with a number of players and then they missed the playoffs. It's not always just as straightforward as sit out till the playoffs start and then come back. After Muzzin is paid out a $2 million signing bonus this year, the real money that is owed to him goes down to just $6 million over the remaining 2 years of that contract. And yes, he does have a no-trade clause, but it's not like no one with a no-trade clause has ever been traded before. In the following year, it goes down to a modified no-trade clause, so the player submits a 10-team no-trade list. I don't know how willing he would be to accept a trade this offseason, but what I do know is that the Maple Leafs cannot afford to do with him what they did this past year. Just not knowing. The Blackhawks were able to get a positive return for Duncan Keith, and he had a full no-movement clause when he was dealt last offseason, and he's more than in the back half of his career at this point. So it's not completely unfeasible that a guy like Jake Muzzin gets moved, and who knows? Maybe the Maple Leafs don't have to give anything up. Maybe they're the ones actually getting something in return. It just depends on what the market is. The last player that I wanted to talk about is Alex Kerfoot, and I think that this one is a lot more straightforward than the first two guys that we've talked about already. Alex Kerfoot had 51 points in 82 games last season, which is really good. But if you look at the back half of last year for Alex Kerfoot, he had 20 points in his remaining 41 games, and then was kind of a ghost for the Maple Leafs in the playoffs, scoring just 1 goal and 1 assist in the 7-game series. A common thing that is said about the Toronto Maple Leafs is that because they're paying all of their best players so much money, that they can't afford competent depth scoring. But they had 6 20-goal guys on this roster, and they had 86 combined goals last year in the regular season from guys like Michael Bunting, Ilya Mikheyev, Pierre Engvall, Alex Kerfoot, and Anze Kasha. But in the playoffs, they only got 4 from those 5 players, and only 2 when there was an actual goalie in the net. They lost that series by 1 goal in Game 7. They need their depth players to chip in. Through the first 2 rounds of the playoffs, the Lightning's leading scorers were Corey Perry and Ross Colton, who played on their 3rd and 4th lines during the regular season. When it comes to trading Alex Kerfoot, I've heard so many people say, oh, after his bonus is paid out, he's only owed $750,000 in real money. And Alex Kerfoot, for $750,000, is going to be very attractive to a lot of teams who are maybe strapped for cash. The problem with that is that they never mention that he has a modified no-trade clause that kicks in this year. And I don't know exactly when that kicks in, when that starts. Does that start as soon as the playoffs are over? Is that after the draft? Is that after this bonus is paid out? Because if so, Alex Kerfoot is not accepting a trade to play at ASU for the Arizona Coyotes next year. That just doesn't make sense. Why would he do that? In my mind, if he's going to accept a trade, It's either going to be to another contender or to a team where there's a better fit, where he can get some more ice time. But if it's to another contender, well, that team's going to have the same problem that the Maple Leafs currently have with him, and that's $3.5 million is too much money to spend on a guy who's just not quite good enough to play on your second line. What makes Alex Kerfoot valuable is that he's versatile. He could play the wing, he could play the center ice position, he could play on your penalty kill, he could play on the power play, he could play up in your lineup, and he can play down in your lineup. Similarly to Calle Jarnkrok, who has a career high of 36 points, who was just traded at this year's trade deadline for a second, a third, and a seventh round pick. That 10-team no-trade list may limit the Maple Leafs' options. But hey, what about a team that's currently on the screen right now in the Seattle Kraken? They're a team that expressed a lot of interest in Alex Kerfoot at this past year's expansion draft, and they only have 7 forwards currently signed to a contract for next year, and they got a whole boatload of draft picks to work with over the next couple of years. That's a team that should be better than what they were last year, and they should have an opportunity for him to play more ice time. Even if the Maple Leafs aren't able to match the return that Seattle got for Calle Jarnkrok at last year's deadline, which was a second, a third, and a seventh, maybe they're only able to get a second and a third, or if it's a second and a fourth, a second and a fifth, I don't know. You know, if the Maple Leafs are looking to move on from Peter Mrazek and that's going to cost them some assets, if they're able to include that second and fifth or second and third in that deal, maybe something else on top of that, maybe they're able to get out from under that contract. And then at that point, I know Alex Kerfoot is an asset, but I would consider my hands washed with the situation. And cap space is also an asset, and it would be nice to have more cap space. And if you're curious to know how much cap space they could have depending on certain scenarios, well, we'll go over that in another video because this one's probably long enough as it is. But that's going to be it for the video, guys, so make sure to like it if you did like and subscribe for more because more is always on the way. And I know for a little bit there, maybe it didn't seem like there was going to be more on the way, but I took a couple of weeks off. I finally started at TSN. I'm a story editor in their newsroom, so I sit and I watch sports and then I write a script and that gets sent off and maybe it gets put on SportsCenter and maybe it doesn't. If you watch SportsCenter, depending on which station I'm sitting at, maybe you might be able to see me like off in the back in the big room with all the computers. That's typically where I'll be. Sometimes not. I don't know. It's cool. It's cool. It's been very fun to sit and watch baseball and call that a job. That's really sweet. That's really, really cool. But no, I'm gonna be back on the channel regularly 2 to 3 times a week, just getting into my new schedule, balancing things out. I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to the next couple of months and what the Maple Leafs are gonna do in free agency. I'm not gonna lie to you. I'm a little bit nervous because of the goaltending situation, and I've made videos on that already. I'll leave them linked at the end, and I'll see you again in the next one, guys.